Everyone called my grandmother a witch. Right before my husband and I left for our vacation, she whispered in my ear, "Do not go with him. You will not return alive." Then she added, "Before canceling the trip, do exactly one thing." She said, "Check the second bag tag on his suitcase." I laughed it off in the car. My husband asked what she'd whispered in my ear at the door, and I told him she just wanted a hug before we left, that she gets sentimental about trips now that she's older. He believed me. He always believes me. That's part of what makes the rest of this so hard to sit with. Looking back, how easy it was to lie to him, how naturally it came, like some part of me had already been practicing. My grandmother has never once been wrong, not about anything that mattered. I don't say that the way people say it about a psychic hotline or a fortune cookie that happened to land right. I say it as a fact I have watched play out my entire life, the way you'd state that a river runs downhill. She called my father's heart attack 2 years before it happened. Not vaguely, not in some way you could stretch to fit after the fact. She sat across from him at Thanksgiving when I was in college, watched him load a second helping of stuffing onto his plate, and said, flat and quiet, "You should see a doctor about your heart before you turn 50. Don't wait." My father laughed it off the way most people laugh off things they don't want to hear from an old woman in a floral housecoat. He was 47 at the time, ran 3 miles most mornings, had never had so much as high cholesterol on a blood work panel. He didn't go to the doctor. 6 weeks after his 50th birthday, he collapsed in the garage reaching for a rake, and if my mother hadn't come out to ask him something about dinner, he wouldn't have made it to the hospital in time. He has a stent now and takes 4 different pills every morning, and he has never once brought up what Grandma said at that Thanksgiving table, though I know he remembers it because I've seen the way his face changes when her name comes up. She told my cousin, a week before my cousin's wedding, that the marriage wouldn't survive its second year. She didn't say it to be cruel. She pulled my cousin aside at the rehearsal dinner, held both her hands, and said something to the effect of, "Marry him if your heart is set on it, but don't buy furniture you can't split evenly." My cousin cried, told her mother, and there was a whole ugly scene about it that took months to blow over. The marriage ended 1 month before the second anniversary, over a story so mundane it almost felt like a formality. He'd been quietly draining their savings account into a fantasy sports app for a year and a half, and my cousin found out from a bank statement that came to the house by mistake. People in the town where my grandmother lives have called her a witch for longer than my mother has been alive. Not affectionately. Kids used to dare each other to run up and touch her mailbox. Neighbors would cross to the other side of the street rather than pass in front of her house after dark, as if something about her yard might reach out and grab them. She has never done anything to earn any of it, except tell people the truth in a voice that doesn't apologize for itself, and people have never forgiven her for that, because the truth she tells is usually the one thing they came to her hoping she wouldn't say. Half our family avoids her at holidays for exactly this reason. She makes people uncomfortable. She doesn't do it on purpose, doesn't relish it, doesn't lean into some persona. She's just constitutionally incapable of telling a comfortable lie, even a small social one, even when a small social lie is what everyone else in the room is silently begging for. My mother has spent most of her adult life keeping a careful, polite distance from her own mother, visiting on birthdays and Christmas and nothing more, always a little tense at the table, like she's bracing for something to be said out loud that she'd rather keep buried. But I grew up differently than my mother did. From the time I was small, I was drawn to my grandmother the way you're drawn to a fire in a cold house. I spent weekends at her kitchen table drinking tea out of mugs painted with little blue flowers, the same mugs she's had for as long as I can remember, and she taught me things nobody else in my family seemed interested in teaching me. How to tell when a person is being honest by watching their hands instead of their mouth, how to sit with silence instead of rushing to fill it, how to trust the small cold feeling in your stomach that shows up right before something goes wrong, instead of talking yourself out of it because it's inconvenient or embarrassing or because the person standing in front of you is smiling. I know the difference between her guessing and her being certain because I have watched her do both my whole life. When she's guessing, her voice goes soft and almost apologetic, like she's sorry to even be raising the possibility, and she'll hedge it, say something like, "It might be nothing," or "I could be wrong about this one." When she's certain, something in her changes entirely. Her voice goes flat and quiet. She doesn't blink. She holds whatever she's looking at, a person's face, a photograph, a piece of jewelry someone's wearing, like she's reading something written on it that the rest of us can't see. That morning, standing at her door with my suitcase already in the trunk of the car, she held my face in both of her hands the way she used to when I was small, and had scraped a knee, and she did not blink once. My husband and I had been married 3 years. On paper, and for most of those 3 years in practice too, it looked like a good marriage. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party, the kind of meeting that feels almost too tidy in retrospect, both of us reaching for the same bowl of chips at the same moment, both of us laughing at how on the nose that was. He worked in logistics for a regional distribution company, something involving trucking routes and warehouse inventory that I never fully understood no matter how many times he explained it. And I worked as an accountant for a construction firm 2 towns over. "Numbers don't lie," he said to me on our first date when I told him what I did, and something about the simplicity of that line made me feel warm in a way I hadn't expected. He opened doors. He remembered small things I mentioned once in passing and brought them up weeks later in a way that made me feel unusually seen. On our 3rd date, he talked about wanting a house with a yard and a dog waiting by the door, spoke about it with a kind of open, unguarded warmth that made something in my chest loosen. I fell for him slowly, the way you warm up after coming inside from the cold. You don't notice it happening until you realize you've stopped shivering. He proposed a year and a half after we started dating, in a restaurant with candles on every table. marital, down on one knee exactly like the movies I used to watch on my laptop in my dorm room. I said yes without hesitation. The wedding was small, 40 people at my request. My grandmother came. She wore a dark dress with a white collar and the flat shoes she saves for occasions, sat quietly in a corner, ate almost nothing, and at the end of the night, when the guests were dancing and no one was paying attention, she pulled me aside and hugged me so tightly I could feel how fragile her shoulders had gotten. "I'm here," she said into my ear. "Always here, no matter what happens. Remember that." I thought it was just an old woman being sentimental at her granddaughter's wedding. I didn't think about it again for almost 2 years. The first year of the marriage was ordinary in the best sense of the word. We bought a 2-bedroom condo with a 30-year mortgage, argued cheerfully over bathroom tile, adopted a rescue cat with a white patch on her chest that he named Frida, the only name in the whole apartment he'd come up with entirely on his own. Saturdays, I drove out to see my grandmother, brought her groceries and her blood pressure medication, and came home to find him half asleep in front of a football game, and it all felt so steady and unremarkable that I remember actually thinking more than once that this exact quiet, uneventful life was what happiness was supposed to feel like. By the second year, something started to shift, not all at once, not in any single moment I could point to and say, there, that's when it changed. It was more like a picture frame slowly drifting out of level from a vibration too small to notice. You don't see it happening, you just eventually realize the picture looks wrong, and you can't say exactly when it started looking that way. He began coming home later, not dramatically later. An hour, maybe 90 minutes, always with an explanation that sounded reasonable on its own. A project running long, a shipment delayed, corporate breathing down everyone's neck at quarter's end. I believed him because I had no particular reason not to, and because logistics genuinely can be brutal that way. I'd leave a plate covered in foil in the oven and go read in bed, and most nights I'd fall asleep before he came in. Then I noticed the phone. He used to leave it anywhere. On the kitchen counter, on the arm of the couch, face up, unlocked half the time, because neither of us had any reason to hide anything from the other. At some point, I genuinely can't say when, that stopped. The phone started staying in his pocket, in his hand, face down on the nightstand at night like it was something that needed guarding. When a text came in during dinner and I glanced over out of pure reflex, he'd flip it over fast and say, "Sharp work," and offer nothing else. He used to show me things on it. Funny messages from coworkers, a photo of some disaster at the warehouse. Now it felt like a locked room in our own apartment. I told myself I was imagining things. I had read enough advice columns and watched enough movies to know exactly what kind of woman becomes suspicious of a phone for no reason, and I did not want to be her. "You're making things up," I told myself. Some nights lying awake listening to the muffled sound of the television in the living room while he worked a little more before bed. He's just stressed. His job is hard. Every couple goes through a rough patch. I said it to myself so many times it started to sound less like reassurance and more like a chant, something I was repeating to keep a different, worse thought from surfacing. By the third year, he'd grown irritable in a way that was new. Not yelling, he never yelled, but a kind of clipped, gritted teeth tightness over things that had never bothered him before. A mug in the sink, the television too loud. Once I made a big pot of chili, something I'd made a dozen times before without complaint, and he tasted it, made a face, and said I'd oversalted it. I tasted it myself after he left the room. It wasn't oversalted. It was exactly the same as always. I didn't say anything because saying something felt like it would open a door I wasn't ready to walk through. And then, at the beginning of our 3rd October together, completely out of nowhere, he suggested a trip. We were at dinner. He was eating his favorite pasta, and without looking up from his plate, he said, almost casually, "You know what? Let's go somewhere. Get some real rest. We haven't been anywhere together in 3 years." I actually put my fork down. I had suggested a trip 5 or 6 times over the years. The beach, even just for a weekend, a cabin upstate for a few days. And every single time he'd said no, too expensive, no time, swamped at work. I'd stopped asking somewhere around year 2. And now here he was bringing it up himself, with an eagerness in his voice I hadn't heard from him in longer than I wanted to admit. I wanted badly to be happy about it. Some real, unguarded part of me was happy about it. The part that still hoped everything could be repaired. That the late nights and the phone turned face down and the sudden salt sensitivity over chili were all just symptoms of burnout that a real vacation could fix. Maybe he feels the distance too, I thought. Maybe this is his way of trying to close it. I decided not to ask too many questions. If it was going to be a surprise, I told myself I would let it be a surprise. He planned the whole thing on his laptop in the evenings, snapping the lid shut whenever I walked by, smiling and saying, "No peeking, you're going to love it." I want to be honest about something because it matters for what comes later. I did not go into that trip suspecting a murder plot. I want to be very clear about that. What I suspected, if I suspected anything at all beyond ordinary marital unease, was an affair. A stupid, common, forgivable, painful kind of betrayal. The kind that ends in a hard conversation and maybe a separation and a fair division of the furniture. That is the absolute worst thing I imagined a husband capable of doing to me. It did not occur to me, not once, in 3 years of marriage to this man, that there might be worse categories of husband than an unfaithful one. The Saturday before we left, I drove out to see my grandmother like I did every week. It was a gray, dreary morning, the kind of low sky that makes the whole world look like it's holding its breath. I brought her usual groceries and her blood pressure pills, and we sat at the kitchen table while the kettle worked itself up to a whistle, and I told her about the trip. I didn't know where we were going, I said. It was a surprise. My husband was planning the whole thing himself. I was talking fast, a little giddy, the way you talk when you're trying to will a feeling into being bigger than it actually is. Grandma listened without interrupting, stirring her tea slowly with a small spoon, round and round, so carefully that the metal metal never once clinked against the ceramic. When I finished, she set the spoon down on the saucer and looked up, and I watched the color drain out of her face. Not fear exactly. Something underneath fear. I had only seen that particular look on her once before, years earlier, at this same table, the day she warned my father about his heart. "You cannot go with him," she said. Quiet, certain. "Under no circumstances. You will not come back." Something in me went very still. "Grandma," I said, "what are you talking about? It's just a vacation. He planned the whole thing himself. He's trying." She shook her head. Her hands rested on the table, dry, spotted with age, the joints slightly swollen the way they get in cold weather. "Listen to me, Chloe," she said. "I am old. I have no reason to lie to you, and I take no pleasure in frightening you. But I am telling you, do not go. And if you won't listen to that, then before you cancel anything, do one thing. Just one. Find the reservation. Find the second bag tag on his suitcase, and see whose name is on it besides his own." I drove home that evening in a state I can only describe as scattered, unable to hold a single thought still. I told myself she was 82 years old, that she had high blood pressure and bad sleep, and the kind of paranoia that can calcify into false certainty as people age. You cannot organize your entire life, I told myself, around one old woman's premonitions, no matter how many times she'd been right before. And yet the thought stayed lodged in my chest for the entire 90-minute drive home, flashing on and off like a hazard light I couldn't reach to switch off. I didn't say anything to my husband that night, or the next, or the one after that. I went through the motions of the week, cooked dinner, asked about his day, watched something forgettable on the couch beside him, while some separate, colder part of me sat back and watched us both like I was already outside the marriage looking in. The morning we left, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom while he zipped his suitcase, and for one long moment I almost told him everything. Almost said, "My grandmother thinks something is wrong. My grandmother told me not to go with you, and I need you to tell me right now, honestly, if there's a reason I shouldn't." I had the words lined up. I could feel them sitting right at the back of my throat. And then he looked up, smiled at me, said something ordinary about needing to leave for the airport in 20 minutes, and the moment closed over like water. I told myself later that this was the last real chance either of us had to be honest with each other, and neither of us took it, for very different reasons. We drove to my grandmother's on the way, since it was more or less on the route to the airport, and I told her I wanted to say goodbye before we left. My husband waited in the car, engine running, scrolling through his phone. I went up the walk alone. My grandmother was standing on the porch already, wrapped in a knitted shawl despite the mild weather, as if she'd known exactly what time I'd be arriving, and maybe she had. She hugged me at the door, and I felt how thin she'd gotten, how her shoulder blades pressed sharp against my palms through the shawl. When she pulled back, she held my face in both hands the way she used to when I was small and had fallen and scraped a knee on the sidewalk, and she looked at me for a long moment without saying anything at all. "Do not go with him," she whispered, close enough that I felt her breath against my ear. "You will not return alive." I felt my whole body go cold. "Grandma," I started, but she pressed one finger gently against my lips, the way she used to when I was a child, talking too fast for her to get a word in. "Before you cancel the trip," she said, "do exactly one thing. Check the second bag tag on his suitcase." I nodded because I didn't trust myself to speak, and she let me go, and I walked back down the path to the car with my heart going so hard I could feel it in my teeth. My husband glanced up from his phone as I climbed in. "Everything okay?" he asked. "She good?" "She's good," I said. "She just wanted a hug before we left." He believed me. He always believes me. That's part of what makes the rest of this so difficult to sit with, looking back. How easily the lie came, how naturally, like some part of me had been rehearsing it for longer than I realized. I spent the whole drive to the airport turning it over. He talked about the rental car pickup, about which route would avoid traffic, and I nodded along at what I hoped were the right moments, not hearing a single word of it, thinking instead about the coldness in my grandmother's hands where they'd pressed against my cheeks. Not the ordinary coldness of old age, but something else, something closer to fear. The airport was crowded in the particular way airports get on a Friday morning, everyone moving fast and looking at their phones instead of where they were walking. We parked in long term, dragged our bags across the skyway, and got in line to check in. My husband said he was going to grab coffee before we went through security, asked what I wanted, and jogged off toward the kiosk near the food court entrance, suitcase rolling behind him until he set it down out of the way near a pillar, and left it there while he crossed to the counter. I looked at that suitcase sitting there for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably only a few seconds. Then I walked over, knelt down beside it like I was adjusting the strap on my sandal, and reached for the second tag looped through the handle. There were two names printed on it, his and one I didn't recognize. Same flight number, same date, different confirmation code beneath each name. My hands were steadier than I expected them to be, which surprised me later when I thought back on it. Some clinical, detached part of me had apparently already taken over. The same part that used to reconcile invoices at work without emotion, methodically, one line at a time. I pulled out my phone, opened the airline's app, and typed in the confirmation code stamped beneath the name I didn't recognize. It loaded slowly, the little spinning wheel turning over what felt like an unbearable number of times, and then the full itinerary came up. 2 travelers, companion added 4 days prior, seats 2A and 2B, first class, upgraded. I backed out and pulled up my own confirmation, the one that had been emailed to me weeks ago when my husband said everything was booked. Seat 14C, coach, alone. I knelt there on the terminal floor a moment longer than I needed to, just breathing, watching people's shoes and rolling suitcases pass a few feet from my face, and then I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and walked back toward the check-in line like nothing had happened at all. He came back a minute later holding 2 coffees, handed me mine, and for one genuinely humiliating second, I almost let myself believe that nothing was wrong, that the tag was some clerical mix-up, that there was a version of the next 30 seconds where he'd explain it and I'd feel foolish for even looking. That's the part nobody tells you about betrayal ahead of time. How ordinary it looks from 3 feet away. How it hands you a coffee and asks if you slept okay. You excited? He asked, stirring in a packet of sugar. Yeah, I said, I am. We checked our bags and moved into the security line, which snaked back almost to the entrance doors. My husband kept his phone angled slightly away from me while we waited. A habit I'd stopped consciously noticing months ago because it had simply become the shape of him. The way some people always stand with their weight on one leg. While we were in the bin line, taking off shoes and belts, his phone buzzed and he glanced down and smiled at it. A real smile, unguarded, the kind he used to give me across a restaurant table in our first year together, back when I was apparently still capable of putting that particular expression on his face. I didn't say anything. I bent down and took my time retying my shoelaces, even though they didn't need it, giving myself a few extra seconds to breathe evenly, to keep my face doing whatever it needed to do to look like a woman who was simply tired from an early flight, and not a woman whose entire understanding of her own marriage had just been quietly rearranged on a terminal floor. We found seats near our gate, and my husband pulled out his laptop to answer what he said was one last work email before we boarded. I watched him type for a while, his face lit faintly blue in the terminal's dim morning light, and thought about all the mornings over the last year I'd watched that exact expression, and told myself it was nothing. I thought about my grandmother's hands on my face at the door, how cold they'd been, and understood now, with a clarity that felt almost physically painful, that she had known exactly what she was sending me toward, and had tried, in the only way she knew how, to arm me for it. Boarding started with the usual announcements. Families with small children, then active military, then first class. My husband closed his laptop, stood, slung his bag over his shoulder, and headed for the gate without so much as glancing back to see whether I was even in line behind him. He walked down the jet bridge like I had already stopped existing somewhere around the moment the gate agent scanned his boarding pass, and I stood there in the general boarding line a few minutes later, watching the space where he'd disappeared, feeling something in my chest settle into a kind of cold, quiet resolve that I didn't fully understand yet, but that I would come to recognize later as the exact moment I stopped being the version of myself who needed him to explain anything. There's a night I keep returning to, one I didn't understand the full weight of until much later, that I think belongs here because it's the closest I came to catching him before all of this, and the closest I came to letting myself see it and choosing, deliberately, to look away instead. It was early October, a few weeks before the trip. I was in bed reading, half asleep already, and my husband said he was going to step out onto the balcony for a cigarette, something he did occasionally, though he'd promised more than once to quit. I nodded without looking up from my book. A while later, I got up for a glass of water, walked through the dark living room, and heard his voice coming through the crack in the balcony door. He was speaking quietly, almost in a whisper, in a tone I hadn't heard from him in longer than I wanted to admit. Soft, playful, unmistakably fond. I could see his reflection faintly in the glass of the door, and he was smiling. A real, open smile. Not the tired half smile he usually greeted me with after a long day. It was the exact smile from the night we met at my friend's birthday party. The one that had first made me feel something warm and unnamed all those years ago. Except now, it was aimed at someone on the other end of a phone call at 11 at night, and it very clearly was not aimed at me. I couldn't make out the words, only the shape of them. Soft consonants, a low laugh, a pause that felt like listening rather than talking. I stood frozen in the living room with an empty glass in my hand for what felt like a very long time. And then, deliberately, I took a heavier step toward the balcony so he'd hear me coming. He turned fast. "All right, Mom," he said into the phone, voice suddenly brisk and ordinary. "Love you. Bye." He hung up before I'd even fully stepped into the doorway. "That was my mom," he said, sliding the phone into his sweatpants pocket, asking if we're coming up this weekend. I nodded, filled my glass at the sink, and went back to bed. I didn't read any more that night. The letters on the page kept blurring together in front of me while I lay there running the sound of that laugh over and over, trying to reconcile it with the flat, brisk voice he'd used the second he realized I was standing there. The next morning, after he left for work, I texted his mother on a pretext. Something about double-checking whether she meant Saturday or Sunday for the weekend visit he'd mentioned. She wrote back within the hour, cheerful and unsuspecting. She'd been at the lake house the night before, in bed by 9. Hadn't called anyone. I sat in the kitchen with that message open in front of me for a long time. Frida jumped into my lap and curled into a ball, purring, and I petted her without really registering that I was doing it, while something in me shifted, not loudly, not with any dramatic collapse, but quietly, like a key turning over in a lock somewhere in another room. Whatever I had believed about my marriage up to that point had just quietly stopped being true, and I didn't yet know the full shape of what had replaced it, only that something had. I want to be honest that I did nothing with this. I didn't confront him. I didn't mention his mother's text. I told myself, the way I'd been telling myself for months by then, that there was probably an explanation, that maybe he'd misremembered which parent he was talking to, that I was building a felony case out of a single overheard laugh and one crossed wire in a family schedule. I filed it away in the same place I'd filed the late nights and the face-down phone and the sudden opinions about salt and chili, a growing drawer of small evidence I kept meaning to open properly and never did, because opening it fully would have meant admitting something I wasn't ready to hold yet. Looking back, I think this is the part of the story people find hardest to understand when I've told pieces of it since. Not what he did, but how long I sat with pieces of the truth already in my hands and chose, again and again, to set them down instead of putting them together. I don't think that makes me foolish. I've had to work hard in the years since not to believe that it does. I think it makes me me someone who loved a version of a person that had already mostly stopped existing and who kept hoping, against a steadily growing pile of evidence, that the version I loved might still be recoverable if I was just patient enough, forgiving enough, quiet enough about the things I noticed. It was 3 weeks after that balcony night that my husband suggested the trip. I understand now, with the particular clarity that only comes afterward, that the timing wasn't a coincidence at all. I understand now that a great many things I'd chalked up to coincidence over that year had never been coincidences, and that the version of me who boarded a plane a few weeks later already half knew this, somewhere underneath the part of her that kept insisting on hope. I boarded a few minutes after him, once general boarding was called, and made my way down the narrow aisle scanning row numbers. 14, exactly like the app had shown me on the terminal floor. I found 14C on the aisle, 3 rows back from the curtain separating coach from first class, close enough that if I leaned my head slightly into the aisle, I had a clear, unobstructed line of sight straight to seat 2B. A woman was already sitting there. She looked to be around my age, maybe a little younger, blonde hair pulled back, wearing the kind of effortlessly expensive outfit that always makes me feel, by comparison, like I got dressed in the dark. She had a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading. As I settled into my own seat and buckled in, I watched my husband lean toward her and say something, and she laughed at it. Not politely, not the laugh you give a stranger's joke on a flight, but a real laugh, head tipping back slightly. The kind of laugh that only comes from actually knowing someone, from a history of jokes that land because you already know exactly where they're going to land. He laughed at it the exact way he used to laugh at things I said, back in our first year, back when I still apparently had the ability to put that particular unguarded expression on his face. I sat there in my aisle seat in coach and watched my husband be unmistakably charming and warm and present with another woman 3 rows and 1 flimsy curtain away from me, and I understood in that moment with a kind of clean, terrible clarity that I was not looking at the beginning of something. I was looking at something that had clearly been going on long enough to have its own private rhythm, its own shorthand, its own worn-in comfort. I made myself look away first, down at my own lap, at my hands folded there, looking like they belonged to someone else. The man in 14B beside me, an older guy in a fishing vest, asked if I was heading to the mountains for the leaf season, made some pleasant comment about how it was supposed to be a good year for color. I said something back. I genuinely don't remember what, some string of ordinary words that apparently sounded normal enough that he nodded and went back to his crossword without a second glance. I remember being almost impressed with myself, distantly, the way you might admire a stranger's composure from across a room, that I could produce a coherent sentence about foliage, while 3 rows ahead of me, my husband's hand found the armrest shared with another woman's arm and stayed there. I kept sneaking glances toward the curtain line whenever I could manage it without turning my head fully, little sideways flicks of the eyes between other things, checking my own seatbelt, pretending to look for something in my bag on the floor. Each time, the picture was the same, his head tilted toward hers, her hand occasionally landing briefly on his forearm to make some point, the easy, unthinking touch of someone who has long since stopped needing permission to touch him. I thought, with a strange detached clarity, that I could probably map the entire timeline of this relationship just from the choreography of their hands, if I watched long enough, the way my grandmother had taught me to read a stranger's hands across her kitchen table years before any of this had a reason to matter. The safety demonstration played on the overhead screens. A flight attendant walked the aisle checking seatbelts. Somewhere behind me, a child was asking her mother how long until they landed, and the ordinary hum of a plane getting ready to leave the ground filled the cabin around me, while I sat perfectly still, doing something that felt, from the inside, almost like leaving my own body and watching the whole scene from a slight distance above it. I thought about the bag tag. I thought about the confirmation code with 2 names on it, added 4 days ago, like an afterthought, like something slotted in efficiently between other tasks. I thought about my grandmother's hands on my face at her front door, cold in a way that wasn't about age, and the words she'd said, "You will not return alive," and for the first time I understood, really understood, not just intellectually, but somewhere lower down, somewhere closer to the actual center of me, that she hadn't meant my body at all. She'd meant whoever I still was in that moment, sitting in seat 14C, with a photo not yet taken and a decision not yet made. That version of me, the one who still half believed a husband's late nights could be explained by deadlines, the one who still drove 90 minutes each way every Saturday, partly hoping her own suspicion was a character flaw rather than an accurate read. That version was not going to survive whatever happened next if I stayed in this seat and let this flight take off and land and unfold the way it had clearly been planned to unfold. Whoever got off this plane, if I let it take off with me still on it, was going to be someone fundamentally different from the woman who'd boarded it. I did not cry. I want to be specific about that, because I think it surprised me at the time how dry-eyed and steady I felt. I didn't stand up in the aisle and make a scene in front of 40 strangers while a flight attendant worked her way down the cabin checking that tray tables were locked. Some very old, very quiet part of me, the part my grandmother had spent years quietly training at her kitchen table without either of us ever calling it training, simply took over, cold and clear and entirely without panic, and started making decisions. I took out my phone, angled it low against my thigh so it wouldn't catch any light off the window, and took 1 photo, both their faces in the same frame, his hand already resting on the armrest between them, loosely, easily, the exact way a hand rests somewhere it has rested 100 times before and has stopped even noticing it's doing it. Then I reached up and pressed the flight attendant call button. The flight attendant crouched beside my seat within seconds, the practiced concern already arranged on her face. I told her quietly, evenly, that I needed to be let off the plane before the doors closed. closed. Family emergency. She didn't ask a single follow-up question, didn't press for details, just nodded once, straightened, and spoke briefly into the small radio clipped to her shoulder. Within 2 minutes, a gate agent was making her way down the aisle toward my row, already reaching up to help retrieve my carry-on from the overhead bin above me. That's when he finally turned around. I watched 4 separate expressions cross his face in under a second, each one visible and distinct if you knew what you were looking for. And I did, because I had spent 3 years learning every version of that face without realizing what I was building toward. First, confusion, his eyebrows drawing together at the sight of a gate agent standing in the aisle 3 rows behind him. Then recognition, his eyes finding mine over her shoulder. Then something that arrived fast and unmistakable and looked almost exactly like panic. When he registered that my carry-on was already down from the bin and already in the gate agent's hand, that this was not a woman having a minor medical episode, that this was a woman leaving. He started to unbuckle. I watched his hand go to the clasp, watched him actually begin to rise out of his seat like he intended to come back through the cabin and stop me, or explain himself, or do whatever it is a person imagines they can still do in a moment like that. The woman beside him put a hand on his arm, and I couldn't hear what she said over the ambient noise of the cabin, but I watched her mouth move, watched him hesitate. I didn't wait to see what he decided. I looked at him for one more second, long enough to be sure he knew I'd seen everything I needed to see, and then I shook my head once, small, final, and turned to follow the gate agent up the aisle toward the front of the plane. I did not look back toward seat 2B on my way out. I didn't need to. I already had the photograph time-stamped, and I already had the tag number and the confirmation code screenshotted and saved in 3 separate places on my phone before we'd even finished boarding, because some clear-eyed part of me had apparently understood, hours before the rest of me caught up, exactly what kind of evidence I was going to need. The gate agent walked me back up the jet bridge without asking anything beyond whether I needed a wheelchair, which I declined, and whether there was anyone I needed to call, which I told her I'd handle myself. Behind me, through the small round windows set into the jet bridge wall, I caught one last glimpse of the plane's fuselage, the door already beginning to swing shut. The jet bridge door sealed behind me with a soft mechanical hiss before my husband had even made it fully out of his seat. I stood at an empty gate for a long moment after that, my carry-on beside me, watching through the terminal window as the plane finally pushed back from the jet bridge and began its slow taxi toward the runway. My phone was already buzzing in my hand. A text, then a call, then another text, all from him, none of which I read past the preview line. I let them all go to voicemail without looking at a single one. I called my grandmother instead. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she'd been sitting by the phone, waiting, the whole morning. I didn't say hello. I just said it was the tag, and I heard her let out a long breath on the other end of the line, a sound that carried in it something between relief and grief, like a held note finally allowed to end. "I know, sweetheart," she said. "I know." I asked her, standing there at the window watching the plane grow smaller as it lined up on the runway, how she always knows. How she's always known, my whole life, every single time it's mattered. There was a pause on the line long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. "I don't always know," she said finally. "Not the way people think. I just look at a person's eyes at exactly the wrong moment sometimes, and I see precisely what isn't there. With him, at your wedding, I saw it in about 4 seconds. I just didn't have the words yet to tell you what 4 seconds is worth." Out on the runway, the plane began its takeoff roll, picking up speed, lifting slowly off the tarmac and banking north, carrying my husband and a woman I didn't yet have a name for toward a version of a vacation that was never, not for one single day of its planning, meant to include me coming home.